Lord, the pattern among your people, Israel being brought out with wild, miraculous signs that you gave Moses to do there in Egypt, one after another, and then not remembering you and not trusting in you when they come to the Red Sea, and having passed through the Red Sea, thinking that the food was better back in Egypt, Lord, not remembering your care. God, I pray for us this morning, Lord, we who often have spiritual amnesia, that you'd be at work in us, Lord, and that we would live a life of faith in a God who provides wildly, abundantly, graciously, perfectly. Teach us now, we ask, Lord. Amen. All right, so it is funny, but not really, the things you forget, right? I'm gonna guess that we have all had this experience where we've had breakfast and we're about to leave, and we go into the bathroom to brush our teeth, and we ask ourselves, "Why am I in here? What am I doing?" We go into a room, we're like, "What was I supposed to grab again?" There is something that in our family we mostly laugh at it, but we also, well, my kids and Melissa shake their heads. There's these 3 plates. They're just like, the 3 plates, each color goes to one of my children. They've been using the same colored plates for 7 years, probably. I mean, since Henry was born. I could not tell you which color goes to which child. And I'm telling you, I am never going to get it. It's so ridiculous. But I can tell you, for the most part, most of the time, how my kids like their ham sandwiches. But then on Friday morning, I was making ham sandwiches for them, which I have done hundreds of times, because that is the preferred sandwich in their own household. And Lily and Henry, they like mayo on their ham. And for James's, I put mustard on one side, and I put it just like, I made it so that it just went to the edge of the bread perfectly. And then I put mayo on the other side, and I did the same. It was just like so perfect. And so I made this sandwich for him, and he only likes cheese. I gave him 2 pieces of cheese, and it was just a really nice looking sandwich. And so I was like, "Hey, bud, look at this beautiful sandwich I made." And you wouldn't believe it, but inside, the mustard is perfectly to the edge, and the mayo is perfectly to the edge. And he goes, "But I don't eat mayo." It's like, oh, yeah, I know that. I have made so many ham sandwiches. I know that. I mean, we are forgetful people. And of course, sometimes it's funny and sometimes it's not. Not very funny if you, I don't know, forget your anniversary or to call your mom on her birthday, or to leave that homework assignment that you belabored over for 2 hours at home when you were supposed to turn it in. Those aren't very funny. Amnesia seems to be something that all of us experience to different degrees or another. And I think this is also why there are so many songs about remembering. Dave Matthews, "Do You Remember?" Right? Maroon 5, "Memories." How about the great Seattleite Macklemore, "Good Old Days"? Remembering the good old days. It's why there's a whole industry really in crossword puzzles and Sudoku, right? Because we believe that if we do these, our memory will last a little longer as we age. And I think it's also interesting that the Bible seems to talk about remembering a lot. It talks about remembering quite a lot. I mean, Isaiah, again, talked about how the people forgot the Lord just after he brought them out and saved them, as if he was not able, right? And then if you keep going, right, actually in Deuteronomy, the book that is written right before they enter the promised land, again and again, Deuteronomy is saying, remember, like in chapter 5, verses 15, for example, "You shall remember that you were slaves in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand, with an outstretched arm." Again, Isaiah, "Remember the former things of old, for I am God, and there's no other. I am God, and there's none like me." Or Romans, to get into the New Testament, chapter 11, "Remember, it's not you who support the root, but the root who supports you." Or our passage this morning. Part of what's going on in our passage this morning is this call to remember, okay? So if you look actually at the last sort of paragraph first with me, the paragraph that begins in verse 14, here we have this call to remembrance. Jesus, we learned right in verse 13 that he's back in the boat again. He's done this a few times, right? We've had a few boat crossings so far in Mark. He's back in the boat with his disciples. And verse 14 says pretty starkly, now they had forgotten to bring bread. Actually, then down in verse 16, right, it says, and they began discussing with one another the fact that they had no bread. I imagine what they're doing actually is they're discussing. I wonder if it was more argumentative. Peter, you were supposed to bring the bread. John, you didn't grab it. Or maybe it was Thaddeus and Bartholomew, because we don't know anything about those guys. Maybe they were the bread keepers, right? What's going on with them? I'm thinking it was them. Whoever it was, they're in the boat, and immediately we know that they've forgotten something, right? That they've forgotten something. They've forgotten the bread there. But then Jesus asks questions, and he seems to ask question after question after question. And the last thing he leaves you with is a question, and he doesn't really kind of even get into their answers. He doesn't wait for another answer. Here's what he does, right? Why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive and understand? Are your hearts hardened? Having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear? And do you not remember? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up? And the 7 for 4,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up? Do you not understand? Just question after question after question after question. And don't you kind of wonder what Jesus' face looked like? I do. He had just said, watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. So maybe there was a little bit of that parental corrective look, you know? I also like to think that maybe there was a little glint in his eye. Oh, we're back to bread. Be fun. Maybe a smile on his face in a way. Maybe a little bit of both. But what is clear is that he's wanting them to understand, to think, right? To think about who he is. Think about whether or not they will be cared for. Think about whether or not they will have enough. Think about whether or not they can make it to the other side, as they have had some storms in the past, even there in Mark. He's calling them to remembrance. Calling them to remember maybe way back when the people were there facing the Red Sea. How are we going to get across? How are we going to live? How are we going to eat? Jesus is saying, do you not yet understand? Do you remember? We don't know that he gave them any bread there in the boat, but we do know that he's calling them to a place of trust in him, remembering who he is. And what is he calling them to remember? He's calling them to remember that he is enough, that he is sufficient, that he is the compassionate shepherd, that he cares for his sheep, that he provides perfectly the provision of God. Okay, so he's obviously doing this. He's got all these questions. He's calling them to remember, but why is he doing this, right? Why do we not remember? Why do we not remember? Verse 11, some of the Pharisees came to him, and it says they began to argue with him, which is what we're getting accustomed to with these Pharisees. It says that they sought a sign for him because they wanted to test him. Now, keep in mind that they came to him because they had probably heard of his teachings. Maybe quite a few of them had sat under his teaching. Maybe some had seen some of the miracles, but at least they'd heard of Jesus and his miracles. If they had been there, they probably would have seen, right, the blind seeing. That's the previous story that we have, right? or the deaf hearing and the mute speaking, and maybe they saw the blind being healed and the lame walking and all of that, and they knew their Old Testament well, and maybe at least they were supposed to put together that this was the kind of thing that the Messiah would do when he comes, when God would restore his people. But here's the other thing with the Pharisees, is that they saw Jesus eating with the wrong kinds of people. They saw his disciples not cleaning their hands like they wanted people to. They weren't kind of going along with the religious stuff of the day. Which is to say, in some ways, that the Pharisees are double-minded spiritually double-minded people. They knew the law of God, but they didn't have it written on their hearts. And so when God was right in front of them, they couldn't see him. And so they sought a sign. And how did Jesus respond? He doesn't respond very warmly, does he? He sighs deeply, which is, by the way, actually a little bit different of a word than what we had heard him sigh with the woman in the previous passage. He sighs deeply in his spirit and says, "Why does this generation seek a sign? Truly I tell you, no sign will be given to this generation." Now, I think that's kind of odd. Why do I think it's kind of odd? It's kind of odd because he doesn't tell them, "I'm not giving you a sign," does he? "I'm not giving this generation, like a whole age of people." And he says no sign will be given. And yet we had plenty of signs. If the three previous stories are Jesus giving signs, feeding lots of people, healing, the deaf man, healing the woman's daughter who had the unclean spirit. There's plenty of signs happening in that generation. And so what is he saying? What's he saying? I think what he's saying is, what sign is going to suffice anyway? What's going to do it for you? You're not inclined to hear anyway. What's going to do it for you? They were so caught up in their spiritual double-mindedness that there was no sign that would be sufficient for them. In fact, in Matthew's account of this story, he says that no sign will be given except the sign of Jonah. What's the sign of Jonah? Well, Jonah goes into the belly of the fish for 3 days and he comes back to life, right? It's the sign of the death and resurrection of Jesus. And he says no sign's going to be given, even except that one. And how many people rejected even that one? God dying and rising to new life. And some people say, no, not for me. In a way, what he's saying is, what will help you remember? What sign will suffice? What sign is enough? Why do we not remember? I think in part, at least, because we are often looking for a spiritual Jesus that is sort of fashioned after our whims or the whims of our friends or whoever. And then when we come to Jesus, we're like, I don't know, I kind of want to go along with you a little ways, but maybe not that far. I like this part of your teaching and maybe not that. We're kind of spiritually double-minded a lot of times. Jesus sometimes isn't quite who we want him to be. He says things, right? Like when he spoke to that woman there up in Tyre and Sidon that were a little bit like, oh, it's a little cringy. I don't really want to share that part with our friends. He calls his people, he calls people to himself that sometimes we kind of go, do we need to worship with those folk? Like, picture this, right? His disciples are made up in part of Matthew, who's he's a tax collector, which would have meant that he was in cahoots with the imperialists, the Romans. And then he calls Simon the Zealot, another guy that we don't really know much of anything about. I don't know why there's these silent disciples. But Simon the Zealot would have been the revolutionary trying to overthrow the imperialists. And he's like, hey, y'all, why don't you come and, sit in the pew? And even if they're like, hey, we'll sit over here and we'll sit over there. Sometimes you're looking around and you're like, I don't know about this. I don't know. Not sure about who Jesus calls to himself. He sits down, of course, and eats with the unclean that, of course, the Pharisees found offensive, but often, of course, we find sometimes offensive. We're like, do you have to have those folk? Love those people? We go along for a little while, and then we want him to conform to our vision of what true spirituality is like, to do our bidding, to do signs for us. But I also thought that it was really interesting that what Jesus does actually in verse 15, he says, watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, but then he also says, and the leaven of Herod. And so why don't we remember? Well, partly we remember because we've got a different spiritual idea of what should be done. But I think we also have this kind of other thing. It's not just the Pharisees, it's also Herod. He also warns them about Herod. And why would they be tempted to be like Herod? Is Herod's temptation another reason why we don't remember who Jesus is, who God is for us? And I think so. Y'all think back with me about John the Baptist. Remember when John the Baptist died? It's just a few weeks ago when Jed preached. It's this close to this passage. Right there, right? It's just in chapter 6. And one of the things that we read is that Herod thought John to be a righteous and holy man. That's what it says. And it says he sought to keep him safe. That's what it says in the passage of John's beheading. Because he thought him a righteous and a holy man and sought to keep him safe until it was politically not helpful, until it messed with his image with the people that were at his party. I mean, you probably remember there in chapter 6 when Herod's brother's wife, Herodias, her daughter came and did a little risque dancing there, and Herod liked it, and he promised her, half the kingdom, up to half the kingdom, and she says, I just want John's head. And even though, again, he thought him to be righteous and holy and sought to keep him safe, Herod said, well, sure. And specifically, what Mark tells us in chapter 6 is because of his oath and his guests. Herod was politically double-minded, right? How about that? I mean, we want Jesus to give us all kinds of signs, right? So we don't forget who he really is, but we really want him to conform to our image and do the kind of signs that we like, right? And we often want to go along with Jesus while it is expedient for us. We get caught up, of course, with political power. How does Jesus fit in with my party's vision of life? We want to go along with Jesus just so long as the crowd around us kind of is okay with it. And as soon as their eyes go, what are you going to do? We go, I don't know. Let's be done with him. And Jesus warns his disciples, and he's warning us about this kind of leaven that makes us forget who he really is. I know, because many of you have restored our sourdough starter, that quite a few of you have gotten into sourdough making. And you know that this little leaven can affect the whole loaf, just a little bit. In fact, probably what you have heard, as I have, is that one of the wonders of sourdough is that it tastes different where you are because it's largely the wild yeast that affect it. So it has to do with where it's growing and what sort of air it's breathing, right? You likely know that it doesn't take a lot of leaven to affect the whole loaf and to give it flavor. And so the warning in some ways is obvious. The warning is to be aware. Be aware of the air you are breathing. They're not hanging out with Herod, but they are sort of breathing the same air. Being taken over in the same kind of way. Be aware of what you are listening to. The political and religious air you breathe, the podcasts we listen to, the news accounts we scroll. Be attentive, because what he's saying is just a little bit can get in and throw the whole thing off. Jesus says, remember, Remember and be careful of the ways that you're inclined to forget. So Jesus calls us to remember. He's told us some of the reasons why we don't, because we are breathing in all this other air. But he also tells us what to remember, and I really want you to see that first paragraph of our text. Okay, so the one that starts in verse 1. If I read that through, or maybe as you heard Gordon read it, walking down our aisle, how many of you thought déjà vu? Anybody thinking déjà vu? A few of you, right? You're like, we just heard this story, except that one of the stories maybe got the wrong number or something. There's 4,000 in one, 5,000 in another. There's 12 baskets in one. There's 7 in another. And again, brothers and sisters, if you just turned your page, the left page just over, it's right here again. It's right after the story of John the Baptist. It's right there. It's so close. It's a déjà vu. We didn't read it too long ago. We didn't consider it too long ago. If you were attentive, you notice some of the ways that John seems to actually be telling you you've heard this before. Just in chapter 6, we heard that a great crowd went to him. That's what we heard there in chapter 8, the beginning of chapter 8. One of the things that we heard in chapter 6 was that he had compassion on them. That's one of the things that we hear again in chapter 8. One of the things that we hear in chapter 6 is that it was a desolate place. That again is repeated again. This is another desolate place. There we hear the disciples wondering, how in the world are all these people going to be fed? Here we hear that. And Jesus asks them the exact same question in chapter 6 as he asks in chapter 8, which is, how many loaves do you have? So Jesus and Mark is trying to jolt their memories, right? I mean, it is intentionally almost the same text, almost the same story. So what are we to remember? What is Mark doing? Why is he telling the same thing again, right? Repetition is the key of learning. Y'all know that? Say with me. Repetition is the key of learning. Repetition is the key of learning. And Mark is doing this for us. He's saying, this is what you need to remember. And what is he saying? What is he showing us? Jesus is compassionate. Compassionate. The first in chapter 6, it says he looks out among the crowd as though they are sheep without a shepherd. Here he's compassionate. And he has spiritual compassion. Think about this, okay? Jesus has been healing. He's been traveling around. He goes up to Tyre and Sidon, maybe to get a little break, and he's got this lady that comes to him while he's eating. And then he travels down, right, to the Decapolis where this story happens. And there we know that people were bringing to him the sick, and he's healing them, and he's busy. And now he's teaching for 3 days. You know, it's Coachella, and he's the main act. He's the only act. And busying himself, and there he desires to teach because he has spiritual compassion on this crowd. Desires them to know him. He also has not just spiritual compassion, but physical compassion. Did you notice this? He doesn't want to send them away because they might faint. Just this little detail. But it's as though God is not so distant that he does not see the physical pain that you experience. And he has compassion towards it. I also want to suggest to you that he has compassion on them because he knows, actually, just like us, that they are prone to forget. And they are prone to want signs. I mean, when do we want signs from God? Oftentimes we want signs from God when we are tired, when we don't know where we're going to get our next meal, when we don't know what's going to happen in the future. Maybe when we are caring for our aging parents and they have dementia, and we say, God, are you good? Are you going to care for us? And Jesus does care for them actually with a sign. He does care for them in their sort of weary state by caring for them and loving them, which is also to show that he doesn't do this for the scribes and the Pharisees because they don't come with a heart that is open to what he might do. I also want to suggest to you that Mark is showing us the compassion of Jesus, that unlike the Pharisees and Herod, his compassionate heart has no bounds. It's wide, first. God's grace is really wide. They're in the Decapolis, which, again, y'all remember the map that we looked at last week? Right, here's like the Mediterranean, here's Israel. The Decapolis is on the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is outside of the Holy Land there, right? They're in the Decapolis. The feeding of the 5,000 happened within Israel. This happens outside of the land of Israel. It happens to the Gentiles. Interestingly, the word for basket in chapter 6 was a common Jewish word for basket that you'd carry stuff around. The word for basket here in chapter 8 is actually a common Gentile way of talking about the basket that you'd carry stuff around with. And Jesus says specifically that these people came from far away, which in the Bible is another way of talking about those who are outside. Which is to say that one of the things that Mark wants you to see is that God's gracious, compassionate heart is wide. Way wider than anyone at his time would expect, way wider than you would expect. The other thing, God's grace isn't just wide, but one of the things that we see actually as we look at this passage, is that one of the things Mark wants us to see is that God's grace is perfect too. It's totally perfect. I think that one of the reasons why Jesus gave his disciples 12 baskets full at the end was maybe because each basket was for one of them, right? They didn't have anything. They came to Jesus empty-handed, right? He says, hey, go get them some food. And they're like, we can't do this. We don't have anything. And they find the boy. Remember, this is from the Gospel of John. John tells us there was a boy with the loaves and the fish. And so he brings them. The disciples don't come with anything. And yet God gives them more than what they need. But here, it's not 12, is it? It's 7. 7 in the Bible is this number of perfection, completeness, wholeness, perfection. God's grace is not just wide, but it's perfect. It's abundant, kind. He's compassionate. He's spiritually compassionate and physically compassionate. He is full of grace, and his grace is wide and it is perfect. That is what we are to remember. The compassion of Jesus, the care of Jesus, the kindness of Jesus, the grace of Jesus that is wide and perfect. So back to where maybe we began in the boat with the disciples. Did you notice the weird detail in that story? I mean, there's all the questions which are supposed to get your attention to and say, why is Jesus doing this? But there's a really strange detail in this that kind of commentators get hung up on. And I think understandably get hung up on. Because listen, now they'd forgotten to bring bread. And they only had one loaf with them in the boat. And then verse 16, and they began discussing with one another the fact that they had no bread. It's not that Mark says, and they began discussing with one another how they're going to eat with just one loaf, and there's like 13 of them. It says they have no bread, and there's one loaf there. Now, ancient Christians took this as a reference to Jesus. That Jesus, as the true loaf, the bread that comes down from heaven to care for the people of God. That if you have Jesus, you have enough. If you just have the one loaf that is Christ, and to feed on him will be sufficient. It'll be perfect. It'll be plenty. It'll be wide. His kindness will be for you. if you just have that one loaf, then you will be cared for. What we've seen, of course, in these feeding stories is that in ways, the amount doesn't really matter, does it? One story you've got, the 2 fish and the 5 loaves. Another story you've got 7 loaves. One story you've got 12 baskets left over. One story you've got 7 baskets left over. Part of the point is the number doesn't matter one bit. If you've got Jesus, have enough. If you have Jesus, you have enough. You enter the boat and you forget the bread and you just want to go off on each other. Jesus responds by saying, do you understand? Do you remember what I did with the 5,000? Remember what we did with the 4,000 folk? Remember how much you gathered up at the end? Of course, what does Jesus do when he has these 7 loaves? Once again, what does he do? Same thing he did in chapter 6. He takes them, he blesses them, blesses the Father for them, breaks it, and he gives it. What is that doing again for us? It is calling us to remember. Remember the wide, kind, compassionate grace of God and the perfect grace of God. And so let me leave you with the question that this text leaves us with. Do you not yet understand? Not yet understand Jesus for you? Pray for us. Lord, how forgetful we are. How much we argue with one another, worry, how much we live out of scarcity, hoarding, demanding other people do what we want them to do. How often we think of power, our need to grab it like the Pharisees and Herod. How often we are double-minded people, spiritually speaking, coming to you while it is expedient. How often we are double-minded like Herod. Yet, Lord, call us back to remember who you are for us. Your abundant, lavish grace for us that is wide, that is perfect, that your love for us has no bounds. We get in the boat of life, which we do often, and we don't see what we think we need, and we start throwing punches and words and lots of worry. God, would you call us back to remembrance? You help us understand, Lord, that with you, it's enough. Hear this prayer, we offer it in your name.